Welcome back, or welcome to our Global Learning Event 2021. I am your Session 2 host, and this is Session 2. A couple of things just to get you acquainted with where we are in our program, what we are doing. This next 35 minutes is really going to take you behind the scenes of our virtual event for the next 3 days. What are the key themes? What is important? You can ask questions that may have come up from our opening session. You can ask questions of our two presenters. You're very welcome to do that. You can even ask me questions, but I will then move them on to our presenters. So all of that means that you see that little Q&A box there on the Zoom dashboard. You can use it. It is now open for your comments and questions. And do make sure that you bring them in all the way through our conversation so that they're there ready to take them at the end. Let me tell you, if you are not understanding me, that's okay. We do have a conversation in a number of different languages. Go to the little globe at the bottom of your Zoom and you will find French, Spanish, Arabic, and if any of the speakers are not speaking English, but I do believe they all will be, you'll also find English there as well. So that is where you'll find your interpretation device. Now, I did mention this a little bit earlier. We are going to be doing polling all the way through the next 3 days so that you can be part of the conversation, not just through the Q&A, not just through the Zoom chats and the Zoom check-ins with you, but also via your device, via your phone. So you need to go to www.menti.com. You will see a little code there, and these are two questions for you. Let's start with this first one. How many years experience do you have working in social and economic programs? Less than 5. Welcome. 5 to 10. Keep going. 11 to 20. Oh, respect. 21 plus. Take a seat. Ooh, this gives an idea of how much experience you have. Thank you. And maybe how much enthusiasm you have. Although those two things do not tally. Excellent. We have done that poll. We are moving on to poll number 2. Where have you gathered most experience? Government, NGO organization, research, multilateral donor? Very, very interesting. Thank you. I know you've all seen those poll results, so now we all know a little bit more about you. We also wanted you to have a very good idea, a very clear idea of some of the country champions, some of the people who truly believe in economic inclusion. And we put together this video. Some of you are in it. Some people from part 1, our opening session, are in it as well. And we will talk about it a little bit later. Let's take a look.
Haku Wiñay, the Peruvian Economic Inclusion Program, has a lot of interesting design features that should be shared. One, the flexibility. Haku Wiñay offers the communities that are working with the program a menu, a set of options that each community can choose from. So each community has the ability to select from this menu the type of activities that are more relevant for their context. This allows the program to adapt to local context, to each community's preference, to its households' opportunities best. So having a flexible design that reshapes the program in different contexts is one of the key design features of this program.
As Pakistan's Federal Minister for Social Protection from Feb 2015 to June 2018, I oversaw the updating of the National Socioeconomic Registry and stipend payment systems, which to me were the single most significant program design choices which pushed Pakistan's agenda for economic inclusion. This was due to the fact that we digitized, made it paper-free, we used real-time monitoring, built-in systems which minimized inclusion and exclusion errors, reach places which were no-go in the past, minimized human errors and judgments, automated through tablets as much as possible, made data entries which were all real-time and GPS location-based, with data consolidation and data correction real-time despite very difficult terrain.
There is rethinking for implementation of social protection programs to have a more integrated approach. We plan to go beyond provision of just cash transfer, but using cash as an entry point for the complementary interventions. The Economic Inclusion Program is a graduation program aimed at enhancing access to the livelihoods interventions for the poor and vulnerable households. The main treatment will include cash transfer, asset transfer, training, and mentorship.
We have brought tremendous changes in the design of the program that include customization of the project. For example, we reduced the duration of the project from 36 months to 24 months. And we also reduced the operation cost of the program. And we're also able to foster partnership with the government, relevant departments, the civil society, and the private sector.
At the beginning, we called this program a graduation program, and that was not a very good idea. People was very scared about facing the risk of losing access to other programs because they were in a graduation program. So we decided we will call it only Economic Inclusion Program.
We need to have a framework, a design that is having interconnected support services that might address the multidimensional nature of poverty. In this regard, the country decided to have the graduation pathways as a way of design choice for the economic inclusion in Malawi. Because this graduation pathway incorporates the cash transfer, the livelihoods, the financial inclusion, as well as social empowerment, especially for women. This is why it is very necessary that we need to tackle the economic inclusion through a multidisciplinary nature of interventions.
The main challenge for Haku Winyai is how to articulate that program to other existing public services, from the social sector to improve the alliance with social programs, but especially with more productivity, other services related to production.
The key challenge, however, lies in the economic capacity to scale up economic inclusion. The resource envelope that is modeled to finance to set the agenda of economic inclusion has remained constricted for a significantly longer period. This is despite well-intended national priorities set out in the national policy documents such as the National Social Protection Policy towards both social and economic inclusion, particularly among the vulnerable and underserved groups in the country.
The major challenge is the funding, because the current project, which is funded by the World Bank, will come to an end in 2 months' time, in the month of June. So beyond June, we do not have any commitment from the donor community for this program. And so this, all the 10 years experiences that will be, gone away. And the other challenge is insecurity, because we have been working in very fragile environment here in Afghanistan. And the third challenge is political instability, because if you don't have security and political stability, so you cannot do anything for the economic inclusion.
It is important to note that Kenya still does not have a legal framework for cash transfer programs. There has also been a few concerns with the cash transfer program funding. Affordability has been one main concern. How do we maintain fiscal space for cash transfer programs? Sustainability has also been an issue. Implementation of medium and long-term strategies are very important.
Correct policy decisions need constitutional protection so as not to fall victim to the whims and fancies of political expediencies. That would be my most sincere advice to everyone. It worked in 2010 in Pakistan when BIS got constitutional protection. All countries need to give program designs the same constitutional protection. So when new governments come in, when they take charge, they don't delay, they don't rebrand, and they don't cost the poor economic exclusion. The bottom line for economic inclusion is If you can see the most vulnerable and differentiate them from the not so vulnerable, you can then and only then give them targeted economic inclusion.
Perspectives about moving to scale from the country level, the realities, the challenges, and also the excitement right there. Thank you, country champions, for sharing your thoughts with us. This is a very unusual session because often these kind of sessions don't happen behind the scenes. Why are we doing this? Why did we bring you all together virtually? This is a framing session for our entire global learning event. We cannot frame it without Colin and Sundas. They're from the Partnership for Economic Inclusion. Colin and Sundas, really good to see you. I am sure that in some way or some form, you have touched every delegate's life because you have been so extraordinarily busy, you and all of your colleagues. But Colin, tell everybody who you are and what you do, please.
Thanks so much, Femi. Colin Andrews, Program Manager for the Partnership for Economic Inclusion, and delighted to be here and welcome everybody to this event.
And so calm, so together. Colin is like a swan swimming along on the surface, and underneath it, you know what goes underneath a swan's legs. So that's Colin. He's a wonderful swan, very calm on the top. Sundas, so great to see you. Introduce yourself to our global audience and our delegates. You're on Zoom right now.
Thank you so much, Femi. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Sundas, and I work with the Partnership for Economic Inclusion at the World Bank Group. I'm a social protection economist.
Sundas, so I have been on the website and it has so much packed into 3 days. There's day 1, day 2, day 3. There are themes, there are events, there are webinars, so much. Help us make sense of what we're going to see and what we can be part of over the next 3 days.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Femi. And hello, everybody. It is so exciting to be live today with the global learning event, Economic Inclusion for the Poorest Moving to Scale. So I'll just let you know who we have all in the audience today. This is truly a global event. Today, we have over 500 participants joined, connected from all over the globe through various channels such as YouTube and Zoom. These 500 participants come from over 40 countries all over the globe, including all the major regions in the world, and 50 other organizations that include donors, multilateral organizations, NGOs, and research organizations. And these all organizations will come together today and the next 2 days to talk about how to bring economic inclusion programs to scale. So we are all really excited. Over the next 3 days, you will hear from 70 speakers, experts, panel members who will bring up really exciting conversation to you, and we're really excited to see how this conversation will shape up for you to take this learning forward. Over to you, Femi.
It's almost like you're actually living in this forum what the Partnership for Economic Inclusion does, which is bring together these multiple voices. Why is it important that they come together for 3 days? Because you could do that anytime, but 3 days in this concentrated discussion. Why is that important?
Absolutely, Femi. As you know, that poverty has always been a monumental challenge for development practitioners. And even more so now with COVID-19 pandemic, poverty has exacerbated globally. And we think now is a really critical time for these different voices to come together. So in this event, we will be talking about how to help these poor people mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 and just poverty generally. And how we do this, how we encourage this to happen is through leveraging economic inclusion programs that are built on national social protection systems and talking about how we move them to scale. So here you mentioned the partnership. The Partnership for Economic Inclusion does play a really important role in bringing all of these voices together on the same platform. So the partnership essentially represents a couple of organizations and stakeholders who are here to support governments in building and designing their economic inclusion programs and ensuring their feasibility to scale. And how the partnership does it is by leveraging some resources from the World Bank Group, the operations, the financing, and the knowledge curation. So we can all come together to help support these governments in moving their programs to scale, especially programs in social protection and jobs. And so we are really excited. I think this is really the right timing for all of these voices to come together. And we're really excited to see over the next 3 days how these conversations will shape up and how this learning will shape up to really set a clear pathway of us moving to scale.
You very deliberately built the program around some key ideas or themes or concepts. Even the opening session was about some very key ideas that you and the team were thinking about at this point. Can you be very transparent about that so our delegates who are watching understand what we want them to think about? Because that's what you're asking them to do. You're focusing their attention on specific areas. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So we have worked very hard on this event, and I will now quickly take you through a theory of change that we have built for this event. And so each day, the 3 days, each day is now built on a theme. So on day 1, we are talking about building back from COVID-19 and building forward to the 2030 agenda. On day 2, we are talking about evidence and feasibility of economic inclusion programs. On day 3, we will finally be talking about operationalizing the agenda of economic inclusion. So all of these inputs in the event, we expect certain key results. And we expect a common understanding of moving economic inclusion to scale in different contexts and COVID-19. We also expect an increased knowledge exchange between governments, practitioners, and technical partners, and a stronger focus on evidence as it applies to government-led programs. Now, all of this is being done in our efforts in moving these economic inclusion programs to scale. So now, to make sure all of our inputs give us our key results, we have incorporated certain activities throughout the event in all of our sessions. So firstly, like I said, there are 40 governments participating. So we will be sharing first-hand government experiences throughout this event. Then moving forward, like I said, there are 50 other organizations participating. So we are ensuring there is a connection between global expertise and country practices. And one more thing, it is, as we all are living in a virtual world now, it was really hard for us to build interactivity in the whole event, but it is really important to us. So we have built tools throughout this event, such as Q&As, polls, and hangouts, to really make sure that participants engage with each other and participate in this conversation. If you, as a participant, want to organize a hangout, we can do it for you. Just let us know in the chat box what hangout do you want to organize, and we will put it up for you at the end of day 1 and end of day 2. You can also email us at peimt@worldbank.org. And finally, this is a global learning event. We are not just organizing an event, we really want to capture knowledge. So we will be recording this whole event and capturing knowledge accordingly, and it will be shared with everyone. So let's just get excited and let's roll on to our day 1. Over to you,
Sundas, I'm going to test your commitment for interactivity. So we are asking people for their questions, and then you're going to give them some answers a little bit later on. So you directly talk to the delegates and encourage them to ask you questions. Go ahead. Sundas, what questions would you like to be asked? That is the problem with interactivity. Sometimes the internet doesn't work with you. Sundas, I was giving you an opportunity for you to talk to the delegates because you said it was so important, that interactivity was so important for you. So I said, go ahead, promote the fact that you would like to have some questions, because a little bit later on in our session, there'll be a Q&A. Go ahead, do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for this opportunity to talk to our participants connected right now. So like I said, please participate. We want to hear from you. You have the chat box. Please put your questions forward, your concerns forward, and we will address them through all the panels that will be coming up in the next couple of days. You will have a lot of pollings. Please participate. We want to see what you're thinking, what you're saying, and these results will be shared with you.
Mm-hmm.
And finally,
Sundas, do you know what? to Sundas, do you know what, just before you're finally, do you know what I loved is that I was doing the mentee poll and I was saying, will you go to hearing, this is the code number, and and the delegates had already voted before I'd even explained what to do. So I love that. I think they're going to be ahead in terms of communication. Your final was what? What was your final? Go ahead.
This is it. Please participate. Please talk to us. This is an engaging conversation.
Thanks, Sundas.
Let's do it
See you
together.
later. Colin, over to you.
With that introduction, what we thought would be nice would be to share a couple of key themes, a couple of concepts in a short presentation. So I'd like the delegates to think of this presentation as your survival kit for this learning journey that we're going to take over the next number of days. Every time we have discussions on economic inclusion, there are a number of questions, a number of themes where people stop and they ask questions. So before we get to the next 20 sessions, a combination of plenary and parallel sessions for the next 3 days, I thought it would be great to gather with the team to share 10 slides just on some of the organizing framework for the session and how we think about the next number of days. So let me start there, and hopefully you can see my screen. On the first slide, we talk about the global landscape for economic inclusion. The global landscape for economic inclusion, as we conducted the State of Economic Inclusion report, showed some really exciting results that we didn't have before. And these are baseline results. This is the idea that there were 75 countries engaging in economic inclusion programs, which were operated and working with governments across 220 programs, reaching almost 90 million beneficiaries. And this data, as I said, is a baseline. We expect to grow this data, and all of this information is available, and you can add information onto our open access PEI data portal. But the slide that you have in front of you reveals a number of important things. The distribution of these programs around the world is quite interesting. We see a strong push in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in Southern Asia region, but across all regions. And we see a very even split across programs that have been implemented by both governments as well as non-government partners. And one of the very interesting findings, which frames a lot of this discussion over the next 3 days, is the idea that when it comes to scale, a huge amount of coverage of these government-led was being driven by government-led programs, almost 90%. And some of the discussions that we'll have over the next couple of days reinforce the point of view that COVID-19 recovery becomes really important. From early data, we already know that the number of countries implementing these programs that we are assessing actually comes to 90 or even more. And we're really excited to work with delegates and to work with the organizations here to actually build up this database going forward. We always get questions around what is the definition of economic inclusion? What are the definition of economic inclusion programs? And what we're trying to focus on in this event is the interplay between programs and policy and how this brings us to scale. So as we think about programs, many of the programs featured over the next 3 days combine one thing in common. They are multidimensional bundles of coordinated interventions, which aim to increase the incomes and assets of the extreme poor and vulnerable group. And often these programs will go by different names, whether it's graduation programs, safety net programs, plus community-driven development programs. They all share this programmatic link and these criteria in common. And what we're trying to get towards in this event is the linkage between programs and policy. So the idea that it's really important as we think about these programs to understand how they're embedded within a national policy and strategy framework for poverty reduction in order to overcome some of these poverty traps and the idea of constraints that we heard in the opening session. These programs are taken to scale by building both on the programmatic and policy linkages. And as Sundas already mentioned, thinking through how these programs build on large foundational investments in safety nets, livelihoods and jobs, and financial inclusion. These will be big topics of discussion over the next couple of days. Before I transition to the next slide, I'll give you a warning. There's lots of text on the next slide, but please don't worry about the text. Take a look at some of the things that I'm going to highlight instead at the top of the bar. As we've worked through this event and as we prepared the State of Economic Inclusion report, we felt it was really important to think of a framework to transform the economic lives of the extreme poor and vulnerable. And how do we think through this framework with the overall goal of strengthening resilience and also increasing opportunities for the extreme poor and vulnerable? And in the opening session, we talked about the surge, the scale, and the evidence base. And this brings us down to a number of sub-level conversations that we will advance over the next number of days in terms of understanding the context where these programs operate, what this means from a beneficiary perspective and what it means from a government perspective, and then in terms of understanding the pathways to scale. What does the response look like? What are those entry points? And really critically, what do we think about in terms of adaptations from the programmatic and institutional side? And then we'll have a lot of discussions also on the outcomes not just from the beneficiary level, but at the community level, and also understanding what this all means as we move to scale in terms of having coherence within a government system. So moving from a simplified framework to the reality that poverty is complex and there are so many dynamics which are going to shape the nature of program design and implementation over the next 10 years. We're going to go into several different strands of conversations over the next 3 days to unpack what we call some different megatrends and how these megatrends are really shaping the design and implementation of these programs as we move forward and as we think about programs embedded within a larger policy framework. And there are 4 megatrends that we'll think about as we go through the event. What does human capital look like? This point that Abhijit Banerjee raised in the opening session. As human potential shapes over the next number of years, expectations and social norms and aspirations all change. What is the interplay with economic inclusion programs? Another major megatrend is the question of demographic trends. As demographies change, as population growth gets higher, what does this mean? Where are the demands going to take place for economic inclusion? And we're going to see a lot of discussion on urban areas. And finally, the role of technology adoption. What does technology adoption mean in terms of trying to do more with program delivery and program implementation? Finally, we'll explore in a lot of detail the idea of shock sensitivity, fragility, and conflict. Living history today reminds us that these programs are not immune from large-scale shocks and that they need to be adaptive. The slide on the right-hand side looks at some of the projections around the COVID-19 poverty projections globally. We know, as Shamron and Dina indicated, 100 million more people will enter poverty, and this is a very real input and impact in terms of understanding how these programs are designed and implemented going forward. Now, really getting stuck into your thoughts for your survival over the next 3 days, we wanted to put forward 3 tipping points in terms of thinking about moving to scale and how the agenda has been crafted around these tipping points and where you need to go to get some additional information. One of the big messages for this event is that while we have a multitude of programs, in terms of scale, many programs are at a nascent stage. 50% of the programs that we considered in the State of Economic Inclusion report had the potential to scale to between 5 to 10% of the extreme poor. We also know that there's a whole degree of fragmented programs in different stages. So as we think about directing this process, what are the tipping points that will make this journey happen? And we focus on 3 issues. The first is political economy. One of the big contributions of the report was really to try, of the report and our discussions over the next number of days, will really be to try and think a little bit upstream. We're all so good at thinking about the technical aspects and the nitty-gritty of program design, but think a little bit upstream about the political realities and what are the factors, the success factors, or the other factors that will hinder program scale-up. We argue, and it's reflected in the agenda, that these are program objectives, financing, and institutional arrangements for delivery. The second point that we unpack in political economy is the idea of political acceptability. We know with our country champions, and we heard in the opening session, that political acceptability often hinges on a demonstrated evidence base. But we also know that the scale up for many major programs across the world, and we're thinking of Peru, we're thinking of the Javika program, is often caused by major events, major shocks. And our argument is that COVID-19 and the COVID-19 recovery certainly counts as a major event and a major shock that's going to change the outlook for these programs as they go forward. So if you want to hear more about these things, there's a certain number of agenda signposts to think about it. For the rest of the day, we'll be looking at government journeys to scale. On day 3, we'll have a whole session on COVID-19 recovery. And on day 3, we'll also have a session on making the case for financing and to Treasury to really try to unpack some of those thorny political reality points of view. The second focus and the second nudge point is on program design and implementation. And here we just remember the video at the start of this session with the various wonderful speakers who are here today at this different event. And we look at a number of themes that they talked about: flexibility, local economy and market linkages, program delivery, digital technology. If you want to hear more of these nitty-gritty details, there are a number of opportunities for you to do so. Again, the parallel sessions today deliberately present, first and foremost, government experiences, coupled with a number of perspectives from partner organizations. Again, on day 3, we'll have several sessions then on what this means in terms of COVID-19 recovery, the role of Safety Nets Plus and as you scale up safety net programs, urban economic inclusion programs, and a very strong focus on green recovery. The theme of green recovery and resilience will be quite prioritized throughout this event. And then finally on day 3, we're excited by our parallel session on Meet the Practitioners, where you can go talk to practitioners and really get a jump start on where you can take this agenda forward yourself. It would be very remiss as we think about program design and implementation not to talk about women's economic empowerment. It's a cross-cutting theme of the event, and we have 3 areas of focus in terms of moving to scale. 3 big questions that we feel are very fundamental in this debate: understanding social norms and aspirations, as well as unintended risks of programs, how we link programs to policy to consider the enabling environment to scale, and what the critical knowledge gaps are in terms of economic inclusion and gender outcomes. And we have a number of mega sessions tomorrow that we're really excited about. First to say, tomorrow morning, the last session, we conclude with a plenary on designing and implementing economic inclusion programs. We also have a special session with evidence from country operations. And finally, to say that we see this as a cross-cutting session. So all of our panelists today have really worked across their 16 different sessions to try and infuse perspectives and learning on women's economic empowerment. And finally, we look at evidence and costs. As you heard from the opening session, this is a major debate that we try to unpack as we move to scale. As you heard from Abhijit Banerjee, this is an unfinished agenda, and our discussion points will focus around 3 questions. What is the evidence at scale? We know that so much of the evidence is driven by smaller scale experimental programs. What does this mean as we go larger? What are the debates around cost effectiveness and opportunities to optimize costs, those economies of scale? And finally, what does sustainability of impacts mean in the long term is one question, but also what does sustainability mean as we think about linking programs to other sector interventions? A number of agenda signposts for this are really important in terms of the debate tomorrow on great expectations and debates around evidence. And on day 3, we've got a number of really practical sessions to unpack this evidence discussion around using data for decision making and program design, around looking at analytical innovations, particularly if you don't have a lot of budget in your program, to kickstart policy dialogue. And then also coming back to the question of making the case to finance and treasury. I've got just a minute left and a little bit of a warning. Get ready for a mentee poll because we do want to ask you a question at the end of this session. So we would like to hear from you on that. Before that, just to say, in terms of the future directions, as we think about this agenda and as we think about our way forward, we're focusing down on possibly 8 topics, but maybe they're not the right topics. Really trying to understand the issues around program delivery and program customization. How we work with beneficiaries to target these programs around the specific needs of specific beneficiary groups. The question on shock sensitivity is important, as well as the question on community and local market linkages. Many discussions on evidence and costs and what this means in terms of moving forward, and discussions also on political economy and partnership. Before closing and before moving on to the mentee poll, I really would like to give special recognition and special thanks to our technical partners. We are a new partnership in the making. Our technical partnership door is open. We look forward to building partnership with many other organizations, and we look forward to hearing more from these partners as the event continues. I think we have a poll, a mentee poll that we can bring onto the screen. And let me just conclude, Femi, if that's okay, just with a question to ask our delegates today. The SEI report notes the following future directions in terms of moving to scale. If you could log on to the Mentee poll and try to understand and try to answer the question, what are the 4 that you would most prioritize? Again, program delivery, customization, shock sensitivity, community and market linkages, evidence and costs, political economy, and partnerships. And we'll come back to this little survey in our closing session to see if any of your opinions changed. Many thanks.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Sundas. I want you to consider this a speed round. So I want you to answer the questions as speedily and efficiently as possible. I know they will come up multiple times during the next couple of days. This one is from Tamam Noor. And actually, a number of other people have asked this. So thanks, Tamam, for leading the way. What is the role of the private sector and how are inclusion programs targeting them, or if they're even targeting them? Who wants to take that?
I can take that question. I think firstly, these programs really aim to create opportunities for economic inclusion in terms of self-employment, access to wages. The linkages with the private sector will become really important as these programs evolve and as they get more mature. But also the linkages to private sector will be critically important in program delivery, especially in those discussions as we think about digital technology and leveraging the digital space. Thank you.
This is one from Fabiola. Can you explain how PEI supports households that have become poor with the COVID-19 pandemic? Sundas, can you handle that one?
Absolutely. Thank you, Femi. It's a great question. Like I said, the partnership, its objectives is to come together, bring various organizations together and support governments in their large-scale economic inclusion programs that are built on their large national protection systems. So in our support to this government, we are indirectly in touch with these households, with the local households, and helping them helping them with dealing with poverty and reducing the impacts of poverty for them. So this is our indirect link to these households through the governments, national governments.
Winnie, thank you for being part of our virtual learning event. Winnie asks, I'm going to give this one to you, Colin. Economic inclusion is an intensive program. Can you explain what percentage of the funds would go to administration?
Great question, Winnie, and we have the answer to that. Tomorrow morning, we'll have a full session on the evidence gaps, and I'll reverse your question, Winnie. I think what we're finding is that the large bulk of investments in these programs do actually go to the beneficiaries. As you scale, those administrative costs become low. But the key driving costs, Winnie, is not on the administrative side. Typically, it's on a major cost, which is dominating the program, whether it's a cash plus, a cash transfer, or an asset transfer. And Winnie, this is really important as you think about the potential to scale, because if we can build on existing programs, build on existing costs, the potential is really high in terms of doing these programs in an affordable manner to government.
Maggie Wangui is from the National Drought Management Authority in Kenya, Jambo. Maggie wants to know, how do we ensure that safety net programs do not perpetuate dependency? That is such a good question. Sundas, do you have a good answer?
It is absolutely a good question. I would really encourage the person who's asked the question to please continue attending our event, because we have a lot of parallel sessions who are in a deep way exploring all of these issues. So I would encourage you to tune in.
And can I have another more immediate answer, Colin?
Sure. I think from the political economy lens, this is a really big debate, but the evidence doesn't necessarily support it in terms of this dependency. We actually see that if you give beneficiaries an opportunity, whether it's with cash or with cash plus programs, the evidence shows that the economic outcomes are actually very strong. And for the Kenya participants, one of the big messages that we'll be working on to support over the next number of days is the fact that economic inclusion programs and graduation interventions, they are a complement to those standalone cash transfer programs. Cash transfers really matter in terms of getting some consumption, in terms of getting to other objectives as well. But in terms to reducing the constraints that poor people face, you need a multidimensional response on that. So we'll be looking at this whole debate and the interplay between Safety Nets Plus and economic inclusion. And that session on Friday morning, I think, is the top ranked session or the most popular session for the next 3 days. So your question is really relevant.
I love, Sundas, how, Colin, how you know when the sessions are, what day, what time. They're ingrained in your brain. Thank you so much for your questions, delegates. Really appreciate you. Sundas and Colin, thank you for taking us behind the scenes. You kind of showed us how the sausage is being made, and why we're making it, so that we can then go on and really enjoy and take part in this knowledge sharing and global learning event over the next 3 days. Thank you very much. I know you've got a lot of work to do. Delegates, great questions. Thank you for your time. I am signing off for you as your host, as your moderator for session 2. There are many more amazing moderators coming up for the next 2 to 3 days. So do stay with us. You will get details of how to be in the various Zoom sessions. At the end of each Zoom session, there is a pulse check feedback session question. I don't get to see that. You get to see that as soon as I sign off. So I will say thank you very much for being in session 2. Really appreciate you. Have a great day.